So let's create a plane in Maya, and I'm just going to set the plane to be 4x4 divisions here. So the first distinction I want to make about the terminology is that when you're in Houdini, you hear everybody talk about attributes all the time, and in Maya, attributes are something completely different. I'm going to look at the attribute editor here because Maya defines the attributes as the properties of nodes. So say for example we select the transform node here. Let's add an attribute and see what it is. Let's call this test. Just going to give it a little number range, and I'm going to click OK. What you can see under the extra attributes tab is our attribute being added, and you can see the attribute is basically a slider. The only data it's storing is the number or whatever it is you happen to put in that box, and then you tend to use this through expressions or something else to connect it to other things in your scene. So an attribute is basically a slider on one of these nodes. So what is an attribute in Houdini? So in Houdini, again I'm going to create a grid. Let's just make this 5x5 because we're talking in terms of columns here. So we've pretty much got the same grid. So this is the parameter pane. If I just shrink the window down, you'll see it's the same as this parameter pane. You get that by tapping P. Just wanted to remind you of that. So in Houdini, these aren't attributes really. This is the parameters of the node, and in Houdini we call them parameters. So this is the equivalent of Maya's attributes. And just like Maya, we can add our own sliders, and since they're called parameters in Houdini, we would use a parameter pane instead of the add attributes window in Maya, because in Maya they're called attributes. So if we go to the gear icon here, we can edit parameter interface, and look, here's the Houdini's interface editor. So I'm going to select a float parameter. Let's just run that across and rename this test like we did with Maya. Hit accept, and look, there's our little slider which we can link in with expressions and do what we would have done with Maya's attributes. So in Houdini these are called parameters, in Maya they're called attributes. So what are attributes actually in Houdini? Well, the difference between Maya and Houdini is that each node being procedural is kind of done with the rest of the network. This just takes whatever data it's passed into, processes it and passes it on. In this case this is a grid node, so it generates some data. The data it has to generate is some points that we see, and the minimum attribute we need on those points is the positions. So if I click on the information here, we can see that there is one point attribute called P for position, because that's the minimum amount of data you need on any point. So this node has created an array of points with one attribute called P, its position, and then Houdini's reading that and then displaying those points in those positions. Now if we open up in the technical desktop, if you look at one of these bottom views and check out your geometry spreadsheet, if it doesn't show geometry spreadsheet, you can right click here and you can go into inspectors and choose geometry spreadsheet, or you can right click on a node and choose spreadsheet. That will bring up a floating version. But the geometry spreadsheet shows us all the attribute data on the points, and you can see all the position data that we've generated here. We can add other attributes. If I create say for example some normals, let's just turn these into point normals, we'll see in the information here we've created another attribute called N for normal, and there's the normal data being created in this node. If I select that node, we haven't added the normal data, and this node adds the normal data. And we can see the normals being displayed in the viewport. And we could add some vertex colors in the same way. Let's do that with an attribute randomize. This will just give me some random color attributes per point. And as you can see, this node now has added a third attribute, and we can see the values here in the spreadsheet as a result of this node. Now an interesting thing to notice is on the grid we've only taken up 6.9 kilobytes, but on the normal, since we added a new attribute with more data, we're now taking up 7.5 kilobytes. And now that we've added another vector of color, we're now taking up 8.1 kilobytes. So as you see, we're slowly accumulating memory as we go down here, as we're adding more data to what we're seeing. And this idea of just passing the data down and being able to maybe not include it or include it as you go through is what makes Houdini so powerful. And we can access this data at any point and start to use it. Let's have a look at sort of what Maya does there. So inside Maya, let's do have a look at a similar thing. So again, I can select the points in Maya, and Maya doesn't really call them attributes, but it's a similar thing. If I go to Window, General Editors, I can bring up the Component Editor. And Maya calls these components, whereas Houdini would call them attributes. Now the difference is we're not seeing the data, there's no data being passed down these streams here. What we're seeing in the Component Editor is the results of the shape node. Let me kind of illustrate that a little bit clearer. One kind of cool thing we can do that you can't do in Houdini, let me just demonstrate that. I mean, this geometry spreadsheet here is just showing us the result of the nodes. So we edit the values through the nodes here. What you can't do is type in values in the spreadsheet. That doesn't work. Whereas in Maya, you can. So if I select here, I can change the normal in the spreadsheet, and that'll update the data. But what you can see here, Maya has now added an extra node here. This node is storing the changes that I've made. So this is kind of where the changes are made, and then it's telling this to update the data that you see. So it's always the result of the shape node that we see. I can prove it's this node by turning it off and on again. We're storing it temporarily there. And if I was to delete the history, edit, delete by type history, Maya bakes that in, and it's permanently in here, and I can't access that data anymore. It's lost to me really. Let me kind of undo that. So let's add some vertex colors as well. I'm going to right click and go to Paint, Mesh, Add Vertex Colors. Let's just paint a little bit. Let's just make some more funky colors there. Something like this. Actually, let me readjust some of these normals. Wanted to see some black ones. Oh, let's do it in that direction. There we go. And that one as well. There we go. So by changing the vertex colors now, you can see we've added another node that's remembering these vertex colors. And again, I can bypass that and turn it off and on. And if I was to delete the history, that would get baked down into the mesh. So Maya's kind of similar, although these are equivalent of Houdini's attributes, except these are components. But these are the sum or the result of the shape node only. You can't select the other nodes and go, oh, it was at this point, what's the data? At this point, what's the data? And it makes it very difficult to access this data and do other stuff with it. In fact, almost impossible. So let me show you in Houdini what I mean by that. So in Houdini, we can use this data to get passed through to other parts of the system, because it naturally just gets passed from one node to another. I mean, what I mean by that is, for example, if we take a copy to points, I can take a sphere, and let's just make it a polygon and a bit smaller. I can copy it to each one of these points, and it's going to inherit those point attributes, including the color there. So you see that the spheres that I've now made have picked up the colors from here. So if I now manipulate the colors by playing with some of the values, you see that inherits all the way through the spheres. And that we can merge all this geometry together. Let me add some normals to the spheres as well. So we can add all this geometry together, and we can see how the colors inherit through down into the spheres there. So this is one of the things that makes Houdini very powerful, the fact that each node is just pretty dumb really. It just does its job, and all it really does at the end of the day is either create some attributes down here, some data, or it updates some of this data, which then gets passed to the next node to do its job on the data or create some data, and so on as we move down the network. We either use that data or read it or create some more data. And those are basically what Houdini's attributes are compared to Maya's attributes or components. Now if we wanted to do anything funky like this in Maya, we would have to start moving into Maya's other modules, which are basically the equivalent of Houdini's contexts. So we'll look at those now.